Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I know everyone says it's a new day here in Congress. Sometimes I feel like it's Groundhog's Day. I feel like every month we have one of these hearings, or sometimes two of these hearings. I was in line at the White House for the holiday party behind someone from the Department of Labor. I'm like, hey, I haven't seen you in about a month. And but it's good to be back because I think it allows us to offer maybe some of the facts that are out there. And I think, Ms. Owens, you mentioned specifically, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics study, the percent of layoffs from regulation is something like 0.1 to 0.4% over about a 7-year period. It's extremely low, yet the percentage of jobs lost due to lack of demand is really the significant barrier. And I'm a small business person for 28 years, so I know this from practical experience as well, but that's the reality. That's the facts that are out there. And I know we talk about the costs that are involved, but again, I mean, as much as I think sometimes we inflate the costs, and I read some of these reports about what something's going to cost, when you actually look back at it, according to the Office of Management and Budget, they said that in fiscal year 2014, for example, executive agency major rules delivered benefits of $22.8 billion annually, while the costs were $3 to $4 billion annually. So the benefit is definitely exceeding any costs. In fact, I would argue it's kind of like that credit card commercial, the cost of this, the cost of this, the cost of coming home to your child at the end of a day without an injury, priceless. Again, your statistics again showed that that's what happens with these regulations. So since this is the Committee of Workforce Protections as opposed to chamber protections, let me ask you a question, Ms. Owens, if I could, specifically regarding something I just did. I recently followed a worker who works as a caregiver. They've been doing this for 23 years, and they're making now $11.50 an hour after 23 years of working as a caregiver. And we helped physically move the body of someone. We did cooking and cleaning. We did all this stuff, nonstop busy, taking care of the pills very precisely, cutting what the person has to have. Look at the work involved, and all too often we find these folks aren't getting the proper pay, the proper overtime, especially when they do overnight shifts, etc. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Just one rule, for example, since I just did that Thanksgiving week, it's fresh in my mind. This is someone who's fighting for a $15 minimum wage in a union. Can you just talk about that?
Sure, and I have had a similar experience. Although I seem too old for this to be true, the reality is I'm one of the sandwich generation, and I had a child I was raising at the same time my mother had advanced dementia, and we had home care workers who she'd always wanted to be in the home, and we wanted her to be, and so we had home care workers, and we paid good wages, and we reported their earnings, and we complied with the law, and I would never have done anything differently for my mother. And I have to say that caring for my mother was much harder than caring for my daughter, because my daughter grew up, and my mother just got worse. The reality is this is a vital job. None of us, I dare say, could do it very well. It requires patience, it requires compassion, it requires a certain level of skill, it requires a certain level of strength. It is a job that has changed dramatically since the 1970s, when the Labor Department first exempted the job from minimum wage and overtime protections. It now is a profession. It is one of the fastest growing jobs in our economy, and one of the two jobs that will add the most net jobs over the next 10 years. And here's an irony. If these people, most of whom are women and women of color, and many are immigrant women, if these women were working in nursing homes or public institutions, they would get minimum wage and overtime pay. But because they've worked in the home, which actually is better care and less costly care, and what all of us want for our loved ones, they have not been entitled to minimum wage and overtime pay. That's just wrong. The Labor Department's extension of these protections, which the D.C. Circuit has upheld, is not only fully consistent with the department's statutory authority, it is good public policy that we all ought to applaud.
Yeah, and it is interesting. One of the things the person mentioned is, people who make $174,000 a year are trying to tell them that they're making too much at 11:50 an hour after 23 years of being in that profession. I think the only thing I'd say in closing, Mr. Chairman, is I know that as a small business owner, I often get private sector businesses I deal with that make me jump through hoops to do various things. And if I want to do business with that company, I do that. And to say that somehow if you have the privilege of being able to do business with the federal government, but you don't want to follow any of the regulations, I do the exact same thing with private sector businesses. It's part of what's called doing business. And if people don't like that, there's other businesses out there. But, I love the business that I've been in for 28 years, and that's something I try to comply with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.